Tonight we are talking about Mank, and tonight we have some just incredible guests that we have with us. Joseph McBride. Now, many people know that he's written books about Orson Welles and many books about film, and he also played a film critic in The Other Side of the Wind. But to me, what brings him very close to my heart is that he wrote Rock and Roll High School, a classic film that everybody needs to see because the Ramones are like in the movie and it sort of captures an incredible time. And without that film, how would generations know what the Ramones experience really was? The other person we have with us is Tom Schatz, and Tom has been teaching at the University of Texas in Austin since like the 40s.
Seems like it. 76.
Oh, wow.
So 45 years.
45 years. I mean,
Yeah.
just think about 45 years of teaching. It's like how many generations of, of students you have. I got my son and my grandson taking your class. It's just truly amazing. And then the idea of how cinema changes during such an enormous amount of time and to keep up with it, and how education has changed. I mean, you've been teaching for 5 years, right? And the last 2 years have been the craziest, insane time you've ever had in teaching.
It's been pretty crazy. These are interesting times we are all living through, no question about it. And as Joe was just saying, and you're doing the same thing with your conversations. We're all learning to adjust the way we do it, and it's and we're learning a lot. And in a lot of ways, we're finding pretty obvious advantages in terms of having to go online, whether we like it or not.
Yeah, there's some good things as well. I mean, you miss the being in the classroom thing. Some of my students say that, but or being on campus, just hanging out with your friends. But there's some big advantages to it. So here we are.
Yeah, and when you're watching films and you can't see them on a big screen, there is a difference about that. But
that's true.
Films are being made for the small screen as well as the big screen now. I mean, it's a cultural change, but seeing Citizen Kane on a small screen and seeing Citizen Kane in a large theater, just not the same experience.
It's like when Jon Stewart was on the Oscars a few years ago and he came out like this. He said, "Oh, excuse me, I've been watching Lawrence of Arabia."
Everybody has the Lawrence of Arabia as the thing never to watch on your
phone. Yeah, right. Well, you'd have to watch it sideways, I guess, to get the widescreen, but even that wouldn't work.
But even then, that's a 4K screen on a good phone. I mean, so there is resolution. It's just, and if you put it right up next to your face, then it simulates that sense of space. Of course, you've got to be insane to do that.
Yeah, right.
So, so we're going to talk about Mank, and so I just thought the first thing I do is just ask Tom and Joseph to just general impressions of the film, from your expectations to when you saw it and how you felt about that. And Tom, I'll let you go first because your mouth was open.
Well, my mouth's always open. I'm really not sure what I expected from that film. Obviously, the fact that Fincher was doing it based on a screenplay by his father, which was a pretty odd move, and a guy who was, was a bureau chief for Life magazine or something, and had one screenplay credit, and he'd been trying to develop this for decades. So that was intriguing, and I loved the idea of focusing on Mankiewicz and the early development of the screenplay. And my impression of it, I was ready not to like it nearly as much as I did. I think it's a pretty strong film, and it's a pretty daring film. And I'm fascinated particularly as I go back and look at it again, at how much it connects with what's going on now. The whole thing with Upton Sinclair, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it really, it's a pretty, in an odd way, it's a pretty timely film. One other thing I'll say is, just technically, it's so amazing, right? The idea of doing it in black and white, but doing it with that red 8K camera, and the Day for Night stuff and the you know the ILM, the effects in that film are just, I mean, it's an amazing film to look at, and one that's both retro and extremely, I think, cutting edge at the same time.
And that's so true that it is both retro and cutting edge. And when you're referencing a film that at the time was the most technically advanced film that was done with deep focus and all the elements that Greg Toland did to that, there's a sort of self-conscious that you have to get something really right to connect in that way. And I think they were up to the task. I read someplace that they treated the sound. They recorded the sound on good microphones, but they processed it to sound like it was sound that would come out of a movie theater in the 40s. So I thought that was really interesting. Joseph, what are your first thoughts about this?
Well, I was reading in a book the other day, I'm trying to remember which one, but somebody described himself as the skunk at the garden party. So I guess that's who I am today. I'm not a Mank fan. I'm a Mankiewicz fan. Herman Mankiewicz was always somebody I loved. I love this guy. And Citizen Kane was my Bible as a young, I taught myself how to write screenplays in the 60s because we didn't have a screenwriting class at the University of Wisconsin, so I had to learn. And fortunately, there was the script of Kane at the Wisconsin Historical Society, and I couldn't afford to Xerox it. I was working as a dishwasher, so I spent a month hauling my portable typewriter up there, and I typed an exact copy of the script, and I took it home, and somehow I borrowed a copy of the film, and I watched the film 60 times in Madison, and I modeled how to write a screenplay on that greatest screenplay. That's the two screenplays that have meant the most to me still are that one and Frank Nugent's script for Fort Apache, which I'm showing to my film Ford class tonight. And Herman Mankiewicz is an adorable figure. He was an acerbic wit, famous wit. He wrote that famous telegram to Ben Hecht saying, they worked together on The New Yorker, and he sent him a telegram in New York. He said, "Come on out here. I'm paraphrasing. Millions are to be made out here. Your only competition is idiots. Don't let it get around." Who couldn't love a guy like that? And he would make all kinds of, acerbic comments about Hollywood. But the dialogue in Kane is fantastic, and the structure of Kane is fantastic. And so when Pauline Kael wrote an infamous attack on Orson Welles, claiming he didn't write any of Citizen Kane, which is just demonstrably false, but the film buys into that. That's my main gripe about it. It gives him a little bit of credit, but not much. But Andrew Saris pointed out in his critique of Kael that I was the first person who ever wrote about Mankiewicz's contributions to the film. In 1968, I did a book in which I did an appendix about Mankiewicz in the script. So I'm not an anti-Mankiewicz guy, but the idea that he's the only screenwriter of the film is false. And the screenplay credit is accurate. It says, I have it in front of me, screenplay by Herman Mankiewicz and Orson Welles. And I think that's fair. Robert Carringer, who's a very good film scholar, did an exhaustive study of the scripts of Kane. Ted Turner owned Kane at the time because he'd bought the Warner Brothers or the RKO library. And what I heard was in Hollywood, there was a big warehouse I used to drive by, and I never went in, I should have, but they had all the papers from RKO in there. And that's where Carringer went through the papers. They're open to the public. And he read all 7 principal drafts of the script. Other drafts have come out since. But Turner, in a fit of pique, closed that archive to scholars because somebody found Welles's contract for Kane, which his lawyer, Arnold Weisberger, had the sense to put in there that you couldn't colorize Citizen Kane. It said you couldn't alter it. It's in black and white, you cannot alter it. So Turner had the chutzpah to say he was going to colorize Kane, and Welles stopped him because somebody had found the contract. So Turner was so upset, he said, no scholars can get into the archives. So they were in Atlanta. A friend of mine spent 2 years recently cataloging all these papers, and then they were shipped to Hollywood. And I said, they're going to be open to scholars? He said, I don't know. It's not my job. I'm retiring now. But that's what happened. But Carringer wrote a terrific piece in Critical Inquiry in 1978. You could look it up if you want. And he demonstrated that it was a true collaboration, and we could get into details. But what, you know, some people have said, well, Mank is a docudrama and the rules are a little looser, but I don't think a docudrama should totally reverse history and make things up. Just for an example, I rather liked the parts of the film to deal with the Upton Sinclair campaign for governor in 1934. That's a very interesting story. Socialists running for governor, and the studios put out these fake newsreels to stop him. But it blames Herman for giving Irving Thalberg the idea. Actually, he had nothing to do with that, as far as I could tell. Joe Mankiewicz, his brother, wrote radio spots attacking Sinclair. So, I mean, that's pretty irresponsible to blame Herman for this scandal. And
one of the problems here is like, where do you draw a line between, you know, what it, because very few people know the difference between what's real and not in those situations. And, you know, it certainly is possible that he walked into this room and said that, Thalberg's room, but probably not.
anything is possible. But I mean, you have to base a docudrama on something that has some credibility. You know, you're free to invent some things, you know, to tie things together. But you know, we live in an era of fake news, as the former president kept telling us. But you know, there's a serious problem in our country that half the country believes things that aren't true, and then half believes something else. And the media are partly to blame because they put out a lot of things that are false, and they have for a long time. We've been talking about that before the show. But the other thing I think I don't like about Mank is, I mean, I think Gary Oldman gives a good performance. He's a great actor, and his performance is interesting. But the portrayal of Wells is ridiculous in that film. And there's a phenomenon of what I call Wells hatred that exists in the media, that most of the portrayals of him on film are not at all close to the real person. The only one that I think is kind of like the Wells I knew was Christian McKay and Me and Orson Welles. If you saw that film,
Yeah, I remember that. Sure.
Pretty good film. And that guy is wonderful. He's a Scottish actor, and he has the charm. He looks like him, but he has the charm, and Wells could woo people, and he had this wonderful ability. I worked for him for 5 years as an actor. He could improvise on the spot. He could make up things, walk around and change things around. He wasn't wedded to any particular idea. That was part of his genius as a director. And it shows that, and the devilish charm that he had. And also there's a certain, you know, mean streak that he had. Although even that film has him firing this kid who idolizes him. And that didn't happen. This is based on a real kid who was with him for 3 years in the theater company. So they always have to invent something to make him look bad. And I'll give just one more example. Liev Schreiber in RKO 281, which is another film about the making of Kane. He plays him as an ogre. You know, he never smiles. He's very dour. And Robert Wise, who edited Kane, told me the greatest performance of Wells's life was when he saved Kane from being burned by Louis B. Mayer and Nicholas Schenck of Lowe's Incorporated wanted to pay RKO $800,000 to burn the film to appease William Randolph Hearst. And so the George Schaefer of RKO was the champion of the film and was holding out, but they convened a meeting of the top guys in all the corporations in New York that controlled the studios and their lawyers at Radio City Music Hall in a private screening room. And Wells flew out there with Wise. And this determined the fate of the film. And he said Wells gave a speech before the film. This was 1941, passionate speech about fascism was threatening the world, and we have to defend freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And he said it was just a brilliant, riveting speech, and people were so moved by it that at the end they said, yeah, okay, release the film. But Wise told me he spent 5 weeks making changes in the film. People never really focus on that. A lot of little things were cut. But you don't see that charm. Anyway, what I objected to in that film, it portrayed that scene pretty well, but at the end of it, Wells walks out of the screening room and George Schaefer is standing there and he says, did you really mean that, Orson? And Wells kind of winks at him like with this cynical little wink, like, you know, I don't know. And that, I mean, to me, that's really undercutting one of the great moments of his standing up for his work of art. You have to imply that he's a fake, you know. So Wells was the thing that I miss in this film and almost every other film by Wells. Wells was a lot of fun to work with. You never see that in films except me and Orson Welles. It was so much fun. And we would work 18 hours a day on this film. I was an actor in the film and I had never acted before, but I was with all these other great actors. And Wells was telling stories. He loved actors. He entertained us. He would make jokes. He would sing songs from school plays that he did when he was a kid. And he was great fun. He was tough on the crew. They were like young guys mostly, and he was ordered them around. He wasn't terribly nice to the crew. And he could be cutting to an actor. He was mean to me a few times. He bullied me for about 3 years, I have to say. After 3 years, one of the crew said, Orson complimented me in the rushes, and I suddenly changed completely. I thought, oh God, okay, now I feel fine. But I played the tape recently, the first day shooting, and he's saying nice things to me the first day, but I forgot. But he was a taskmaster because I couldn't act and I had to do exactly what he told me to. But he let me write my lines with him and all that. But he was just a delight to work with. And by the end of the day, I'd go home and my face would hurt because I'd been smiling and laughing so much. You don't get that from Mank, certainly. Wells comes in, he's a monster, breaks into the hotel room like an ogre from a horror film. Anyway, that's my little talk. I wrote a long piece on this film on wellsnet.com, which is a good Wells fan site, but other people may disagree. Tom disagrees to some extent, but
yeah, let me jump in for a minute.
And if you could,
this whether we want to read this as a docudrama or not, I think the film pretty quickly establishes that it's fictional.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming Fincher's done his research, and there are so many errors. I mean, we could spend the whole time just talking about all from that, including that telegram you described, which in this film is sent to letterer and it's reworded. And I mean, there are all kinds of ways, and that occurs very early in the film. I mean, for me, this is and it's also worth mentioning that, and I've read your stuff and the Herringer book, which is quite good, the Herringer book, and you know, I read the Pauline Kael thing when it came out, which I'm guessing you like, because it's so great on Mankiewicz. I mean, it really.
Well, I don't like it because it's so unfair to Wells.
Well, it's
she says a lot of wonderful things about Mankiewicz, and
Yeah.
You know, it's great. I mean, I'm a screenwriter. I love it when they make a movie about a screenwriter, and so that's. But you know, they could have made a movie about collaboration. The two guys collaborated.
Well, yeah, what I was going to say is that this is not about the collaboration. I mean, this is about you know, obviously this is about the first draft, and you know, the collaboration that occurred afterwards that's another story, and it would be an interesting one to see. And a guy named LeBeau, or something, I think LeBeau is. Anyway, this further research has been done that indicates that the final draft of the film was pretty radically revised during shooting by Wells, you know, on the fly. I don't think we're ever going to get to the bottom of this, which is why we keep coming back to this story. And you know, for me, it's really a story about Mankiewicz, and it's a story about Hollywood in the 30s, and it's a story obviously about about the first draft there was apparently a 300 plus draft titled American, and that was primarily Mankiewicz's work, and at that point Wells became more involved, and it became Citizen Kane, and the title, and Houseman was involved, and et cetera, and some studio guy came up with the title 3 or 4 drafts in apparently. But this to me is much more about Mankiewicz, and you know, part of the story that's to me that I like is that, you know, it's told through this alcohol haze that that was Mankiewicz for that period of his life, and you know what it's doing to reconstruct his relationship. And we know that, you know, I think we know that he and Marion Davies weren't really that close. But you know, the film plays, I mean, that relationship, I think, works in terms of the film. I think it's just a matter of what we expect that film, how much we expect that film to be all that accurate. There is a key moment in the film where Mankiewicz says to Shelley before he kills himself about those newsreels, it's not news and it's not real. And you know and this is a film that I think Fincher knows what he's doing. I mean, we know he's a meticulous, perfectionist and a painstaking researcher. So what's he up to? And whether we want to hold his feet to the fire for all the ways that it's inaccurate, particularly inaccurate in telling a story that we'll never know quite what the truth is, no matter how close we get to it. So anyway,
it's like really interesting that we're talking about, is this accurate? And then you think about the films. This isn't Kane, and is that an accurate portrayal of Hearst?
Well, it's portrayed. Kane, though, is a fictional character. He's not called William Randolph Hearst. I mean, I disagree.
But
yeah.
It is a narrative film, and I don't think, and it's like, do you really believe that JFK is what happened with the assassination? Because I don't.
I do. It's a pretty accurate film, in my opinion. I disagree with some part. I mean, ironically, it was attacked for being inaccurate by the press, which has gotten the story wrong since 1963. But almost everything that happens in that film is accurate. But I would disagree with a couple points. First of all, we could talk, when you mentioned JFK, that's a huge controversy about docudrama. Where does the responsibility lie? For example, nobody complains that Shakespeare in his history plays alters history or has them speak in iambic pentameter and things like that, because it's so long ago, we don't care. And he's portraying these people in a psychologically acute way. That is okay. We care more about recent history because we were around at the time. Or with Kane, I disagree that we'll never know what happened with Kane. I think Carringer settled most of the issues with. As a biographer and historian, I rely on documents more than on oral history, because oral history can be wrong. You look at the documents, you compare them to the oral history. But one thing that isn't clear, first of all, it wasn't the first draft. Well, that's one of the things that the film gets wrong, and this is a pretty serious thing that it gets wrong. It leaves out the fact that Mankiewicz and Wells spent about a month or 5 weeks talking through the film before Mankiewicz went to Victorville.
Yeah.
And that's substantiated, and there's a biography of Mankiewicz that's good, and other sources. And that's a really important part of screenwriting. You work out pretty much what it's about, but there's a terrible phrase in Hollywood called the actual writing. Okay, so Mankiewicz does the actual writing is awfully important. So he goes to Victorville. He's writing this big draft by himself because Wells wanted him to be on his own, but Hausman was his babysitter because Mankiewicz was a drunk. But Wells told me, and this is not, you can't document this. This is one of the mysteries. We were shooting The Other Side of the Wind in 1971 in Coldwater Canyon area of Beverly Hills, and the scene where I'm thrown out of John Huston's car, Wells pointed to a white ranch house at the end of the street. And he said, "You see that house?" He said, "Contrary to what you've read, that's where most of Citizen Kane was written." And he told me he was writing a first draft in parallel with Mankiewicz. They were both writing drafts, and nobody's found that draft. So that's a question mark. But the fact is, and this is not, the film leaves out this extensive period of discussions. Plus, Wells came to Victorville several times to talk to Mankiewicz. In the film, you just see him coming, I think, once to throw a tantrum. But there are photographs of him having a nice, friendly chats with him. And Hausman did a lot more work on the script than the film would have you believe. But then when Mankiewicz finished that draft, there were 6 other drafts at least, and they found another one recently at Yale. Wells did a tremendous amount of work, and Carringer went through all these and showed that Wells, restructured things, eliminated things, rewrote things, condensed things, and added scenes. And people who worked on the film said, Wells was dictating new scenes all the way through shooting. You don't get that sense at all in the film. So why make a film? I don't think you can say it's enough to say it's fictional, because it's not. It's about a real film and a real guy. And also, Fincher at one point said, well, he was a drunk and it's filmed like through an alcoholic haze, which is what you said. I don't think that's a very good excuse, frankly, for getting getting facts screwed up to say the guy was a drunk. I mean, unless you're going to film it as a kind of hallucinatory fantasy, which is not exactly. I mean, you do get a sense of him, like there's a scene that I like where he tells his secretary, sneak in some booze for me because I can only write well when I'm drunk, and then he has writer's block and then he starts writing. That kind of thing is interesting. I don't know if that actually happened, but so there are moments that are good in the film, and some of the relationships are well portrayed with the woman who plays Davies and the woman who plays the secretary, etc. But I think that it's not a fictional film. It purports to be about a real film that's one of the most famous films ever made. And I just think when I say a film about collaboration would have been more interesting, spend some time in that period where they're hashing out what this film is going to be about, and then dramatize how Wells rewrote the thing and how did Mankiewicz feel about that. And, I mean, it would have been more interesting to me. Collaborations are very complex. And another thing in film collaboration, I've studied that in my books, like with Capra and Robert Riskin. You can determine pretty much who contributed what to a film, but you can never be 100% certain because you're not in the room with them. I interviewed Capra's secretary, for example, who typed the scripts and was there at the time. And, you get as close as you can to, but I couldn't find the drafts that Riskin had written. I found the final scripts, with some handwritten emendations and things, but the documentation is not always 100% there. Sometimes you're lucky if you have a recording of the collaborative sessions, but that doesn't happen very often. So you have to fill in some gaps, but I think we know pretty much what happened on that film.
So, Tom, do you want to talk about, from your sense, how much is this filmmaker, is Fincher, have to tell the truth? Is, because it's not a documentary, it is a drama. What is your take on this?
I think that, and then we can go round and round on this. Joe, I think Joe wants, you want a different movie. You want a movie about a different stage of this making of Citizen Kane. I mean, for me, the strongest aspect of the film is the relationship between Mankiewicz and Hearst. And I don't know, we know that Mankiewicz hung out at San Simeon a bit. And now how he conceptualized that, how he conceptualized the American as this fictional take on Hearst, how that relationship developed, and the way the movie plays with time, much the way Citizen Kane does, in terms of the flashbacks create a chronological reconstruction of Kane's life. They seem to be random in terms of this guy Thompson interviewing all these people, but they reconstruct Kane's past chronologically. And this film does more or less the same thing. It's not quite straight chronological order in terms of the flashbacks, but it goes back to 1930 and then 33, 34, and it jumps around a little bit in 34, and then works its way up to that party in 37 where Mankiewicz tells the story. He does that. I'm gonna update Quixote, and to me that in terms of of imagining how he might have reconceptualized his relationship with Hearst to create this story with Orson Welles. I mean, that to me is what the film is about, and I think you're absolutely right to say it's clearly accurate that the two of them hashed out the story once Welles heard this idea, and the complexities of that collaborative process are important. But what this is, to me, what this is about is the conception of Citizen Kane and Mankiewicz and Hollywood.
Well, the conception, both people disagreed. Wells said it was my idea to do it multifaceted, and Herman said the same thing. So that we won't know. And that's typical of Hollywood. I mean, for example, the ending of Rock and Roll High School, blowing up the school, that was my idea. And the director told me at the time, well, we can't do that because it'll make the kids look unsympathetic. So I had to trick him into doing that. It's a long story, but now he thinks he invented that himself. He said, when I was in high school, I would sit around and fantasize about blowing up my school. Just bullshit. He never said that when he, and I called him, and the first time he told that to the press, I said, every time you tell that lie, I'm going to give an interview to the press and say you're lying. And he's been lying since 1979 about it. But directors have to imagine they thought it all up themselves. So there is some gray area in every film, but I would say, I kind of think you're right in some ways about Mankiewicz and Hearst, although I thought you were going to say the most interesting relationship in the film is Mankiewicz versus Mankiewicz. That's what I would say the
Joe
conflict
and
in
Herman,
this.
you mean?
Herman and Herman's internal
okay.
conflict, because conflict makes a good character.
Not Herman and Joseph.
Not Herman and Joe, just Herman is a conflicted man, you know,
Yeah.
because the film does show some of that he's betraying his friend or his I don't know what you call Hearst, his the guy who had him over for dinner all the time, and Marion Davies,
The patron.
patron is the word, yeah. Marion Davies is portrayed as a friend of his more than she really was, but that's an interesting relationship, and he feels like he's betraying her. Wells later, the one regret he said about the film was he said we were unfair to Marion Davies, who was a fine woman and a talented actress. So that's kind of an interesting transposition, and I think that scene where he's confronting Hearst drunkenly at his dinner table, and Hearst is portrayed as a fairly sympathetic figure, is a good scene. Interesting. I don't know if it ever happened, but I'm willing to say, okay, fine.
Okay.
It may never have happened, but it's an interesting scene where he's expounding on his what he's thought of Hearst. And obviously there was, he was a journalist. That's one reason it's a great film. It's about journalism and Hearst, and he had this tremendous lore. Wells said, I could never have done this on my own because Herman Mankiewicz brought all this journalistic lore and knowledge of Hearst. There was also a lawsuit. Author of a biography of Hearst sued them for plagiarism, and RKO settled out of court, but that's another issue. But I think that there's something to that. But what I would say is, why couldn't they have spent 5-10 minutes even showing them talking in Hollywood before they go to Victorville, and kind of hashing out ideas? And Wells could say, I had this idea about a multifaceted, and Herman could say, I had that idea. That happens a lot with directors. I said to a director once, why don't we do a spoof of the movie Earthquake from today's point of view with better special effects? And he said, yeah, I've been thinking about that for years. Whenever you tell an idea to a director, they've always been thinking about it for years. But that instead, Wells is just a complete ogre, and the film basically says he stole credit, which is just wrong. And at the end of the film, Mankiewicz says, "I wrote this without Orson Welles," right?
I think we just blame this on Pauline Kael, which is fine by me. I'm actually working on a film about Andrew Sarris and Molly. So I do think that the beginning of the inspiration for this did come from the Pauline Kael essay. Is that not right?
Yeah, she wrote this terrible piece in 1971. She called me the day it came out, by the way, which is interesting. I picked up the phone and Pauline Kael here, and I've never talked to her before. And she wanted to apologize to me because she makes fun of me in the opening paragraph twice. And because she's quoting highbrow intellectual pretentious critics who say pretentious things about Kane. And what I wrote was sort of pretentious, but hey, I was 23 years old or whatever. But she said, I want to apologize because I didn't use your name and I pretended you were two people instead of one person to make it seem better, which is not a good sign. But she said her editor, William Shawn, had forbade her to attack critics by name because she did that a lot in her previous writing, and he didn't like that. So she said, that's why I didn't use your name. And I said, I don't mind, I don't care. But, I had a 30-minute talk with her about it. I said, why didn't you interview Wells? And she said, well, I knew what he would say. That's not an adequate argument. And I said, why did you not interview other people? She didn't do much research. She stole her research from Howard Suber of UCLA, as you probably know. He was a professor, and he had done a lot of interviews with people and research. And she made a deal with him. He thought he was going to be billed as co-writer,
right,
and share the profits. She paid him $350 and screwed him on the credit, which is ironic. but she didn't do her research properly. Tom is the kind of guy who does meticulous research and documents, and I mean, both of us. That's how you do responsible film
But
history.
also the thing about Pauline Kael is that if you think of this in the context of like the largest like argument in the history of film criticism about the auteur theory, because this is Pauline Kael's fight against the auteur theory.
Yeah, that's the motive for a lot of. Sarah said that at the time. He understood it was kind of an attack on him and auteurism, which was
absolutely.
Auteurism was really created by the French, Truffaut.
Right.
Although it was imported to America by Sarris, who modified it to some extent. But Sarris said, I never intended for it to mean that the director does everything. That's how it's been bastardized into that form. One thing I found when I joined academia in 2002. I was surprised by a number of things. One was they all automatically hate auteurism. They think it's terrible. And I was called an auteurist, like it's a dirty word. And I said, well, if you read my books, like my Capra biography, Richard Corliss said is a 700-page deconstruction of the auteur theory, but they didn't care. But every course in every university is modeled on auteurism. It's always Orson Welles' Citizen Kane or Robert Bresson's such and such, and they never credit the writer. One student told me I was the only person who ever mentioned screenwriters in class, and I do this religiously because I'm a member of the writers.
I just have to tell you this. I had Andrew Saris as a teacher at Columbia University, and he taught a class about great screenplays. One of which, by the way, he went on and on about all about Eve, Joseph Mankiewicz. So Saris definitely had a deep appreciation for screenwriting.
Good to hear. Yeah, I mean, it's simplistic. I mean, what I've evolved over the years is multiple authorship, which I think is more accurate. That Capra and Riskin. I think Riskin was more the author of the Capra films than Capra was. It's a controversial statement, but they both contributed. They were better together than they were separately. And Mankiewicz and Welles, this film would not be as great if it weren't for the two of them working together. And it's often said that Welles on his own never wrote a script as good as Citizen Kane, which is true. I mean, he did adapt Shakespeare, but he had Shakespeare as a collaborator and Booth Tarkington, but he was not, in some ways, he wasn't as good a screenwriter as Mankiewicz, and that's worth acknowledging.
But Joseph, I do want to mention this because this is, I think, really key to the discussion we're having. When you're doing film, and in almost most artistic endeavors, there is this moment of collaboration. You're on a set, you take opinions from so many different people. And then because in that moment of creativity, it's like you need everything you can get to make something work, like every little thing. And then what happens is, because of both business and ego, like everybody claims all kinds of different things. And sometimes our memories get fogged by our ego and our business interest. And we actually believe things that didn't necessarily happen, because it's really hard when two people are writing a song together. Somebody will claim they did this and somebody will claim they did that. I mean, this is the history of creativity.
Well, you can't. Yeah, it's really true. And the film business is full of liars and lying on top of that.
Welles did a whole movie about telling lies.
F for fake.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean,
and actually,
more essence.
Pat McGilligan wrote a good biography called Young Orson, and he said he discovered in the course of that everybody assumed that Welles was an inveterate liar. And he said what surprised him was that Welles's stories checked out about, I think he said about 90% of the time. The most far-fetched things, Welles led an amazing life. He said he was a bullfighter when he was a kid, briefly, and Pat said he found out it was true, So he didn't lie as often as people think, but Capra lied all the time. I mean, Capra's autobiography is a lie from start to finish. And the only two things to check out are the date of his birth and the date he got on the ship for America. And I got the documents to prove it. Everything else is false. So it's endemic.
I heard that Welles got his first acting job by lying that he had experience acting.
His first professional job with the Gate Theatre in Dublin. That's true.
Right.
But
his career starts with a lie.
Yeah. Well, yeah. But getting
starts with the performance.
Yeah, he was an actor. But getting into the collaboration thing, I edited the AFI seminars into 2 books. I read all their seminars, and the epigraph I used was from Alan Pakula, the fine director, who said, the worst thing about movies is they're collaborative, and the best thing about movies is that they're collaborative. I thought that was profound, because it is a collaborative art. You need, dozens or hundreds of people to make a film. You can't make a film without a script. A director without a script is nowhere. And then the actors add a lot to it, and cinematographer and all kinds of people. And then, as Jean-Renoir said, the audience adds a lot to it. But so it is a collaborative art, whether you like it or not. And if you're going to make a film about a film, I think you should show that more than that. But I mean, it is interesting. Mankiewicz holed up in that hotel room is an interesting subject. I just thought, in terms of sheer filmmaking, there were some flaws. I couldn't figure out why Fincher had him stuck in that room for an hour, because he would go outside and do some writing. And I read that he and his secretary had this sort of running battle every day, like, should we go outside or should we stay in the room? And, just for visual variety. And also every night, Houseman and Mankiewicz would go to a local dive and have dinner and have like one drink each. He was rationed. And they'd watch local people dance to country western music. Now, that would have been a charming scene in the film. But instead, they kept him in this dark hotel room all through most of it.
I just have to say this, because I do a lot of Q&As after films, and this is like a thing. It's like, wouldn't it be great if they did this in this film? And, you say, like, well, you make that film. This is not.
Yeah.
This is
I realize
the film that Fincher wanted to make. He had a very definitive choice, in the same way that Wells has definitive choice of what elements of the story he told the truth for, and what things were in service of the story that he wanted to tell.
Well, he redid his father's script. You probably know his father died a long time ago. And
yes.
I read the original script before I saw the film, which really worried me, because it's very simplistic. Even David Fincher said, gee, my dad really wrote a one-sided pro-Pauline Kael script. And so Eric Roth and David Fincher rewrote the script to some extent. I was really hoping, I always hope for films to be good. And I thought maybe these guys will straighten it out and make it a better film, but they didn't really improve on it that much. But I see that Raquel had an interesting point. There are some differences between the script and the page in the film. And just one that I'll mention, it's always a good point. Bogdanovich said to Wells, the character of Kane is more sympathetic in the film than in the script, isn't he? And Wells said, that's true. And Peter said, why is that? And he said, I found out more about the character as I played him. I thought that was a terrific comment, because that's what an actor does. Because to play any character, even if it's Adolf Hitler or anybody, you have to kind of empathize with that character, or at least see it from his or her point of view. And Kane is a charming rascal in the film, and he is in the script too, but you really kind of like him more in the film than you do in the script, I think. And that's just one example of the complexity of that film.
So, Tom, we haven't heard from you in a while.
Well, this argument, and here I am, the token academic in this group, and I have over the years, I have a regular rotation of advanced undergrad courses, American independent film and modern horror. But then I have a course on Eastwood that I teach every couple of years, a course on Scorsese that I teach every couple of years, and of course I'm teaching now on Hitchcock. And and those are by no means courses that argue that the director does everything, or that the director's the sole creative force in films. That a point, and we could do this up tour argument until the cows come home, but a point that I would make is that probably the most significant auteur in terms of the early battles over this so-called, it was a politique, a policy for these French kids, and they were these young critics writing for a guy named Andre Bazin at Cahiers du Cinema in the 50s, and these young Turks, and they were in their early 20s. Yeah. And this included Jean-Luc Godard, Francois Truffaut, Eric Rohmer, etc. And these guys become the French New Wave in the 60s. But it's worth mentioning that the first really serious good book on film authorship was Truffaut's book, the Hitchcock book, Truffaut Hitchcock.
Yeah.
which was based on 50 hours of interviews, and it's a truly amazing book. But the Hitchcock argument is it's a great place to start if we're going to talk about auteurism, because this is a guy who after his very early career, when he was not very successful, never wrote a screenplay, never had screen credit, was involved in the development of screenplays, but yet I think we're all comfortable saying a Hitchcock film, and that somehow that means something. And where does that come from?
Well, can I give you my? Wait, I'll let you finish.
All right, but and a guy named Robin Wood writes the first really good book in English, I think, on authorship. And it's on Hitchcock. But I think Hitchcock winds up being a good example of how complicated this idea of authorship is and how important collaboration is. And as we're thinking about Hitchcock's career, the espionage films in the 30s that put him on the map, 39 Steps, Lady Vanishes, the early version of The Man Who Knew Too Much, the female Gothics in the 40s, this combination in the 50s of these romantic thrillers and with top stars and high production values, and the TV series. What's interesting about all that is that Hitchcock develops these cycles with different units, with different creative collaborators, and very consistent ones through these periods. So, the Hitchcock, when we think about someone like Hitchcock, and the point ultimately is that through all of that, there's something that we associate with Hitchcock.
I think,
and it's as Hitchcock once said, I'm less interested in stories than in the manner of telling them. And his manner of storytelling is distinctive and identifiable.
one thing that the French devised the auteur theory, which, as you say, they called the politique des auteurs, to account for directors who don't write their films. That point is always lost. People think an auteur is somebody who writes and directs his films. That's just not really true. Sure, you have Ingmar Bergman, Woody Allen, people like that, but they were accounting for people like Raoul Walsh, who didn't write his own films. However, Hitchcock, if you look into what he did, he and his wife Alma, who is his most important collaborator, Alma Revel, who I interviewed, they would spend months plotting out a film. They would write 100-page treatment together. She was a screenwriter. She had credit on 8 of his films, and she worked on all of them. They would write a very meticulously detailed treatment of all the basic action and plot. Then they would hire a writer, like a novelist or a playwright usually, to come in and flesh it out and kind of make the characters more plausible, because Hitchcock was better at plot than character, So Hitchcock didn't take credit on those scripts, but Howard Hawks, who I interviewed for the book Hawks on Hawks, I said to him, how come you didn't take writing credit after your early films? His name appears on the scripts of a few films. And he said a really brilliant thing. He said, because if I did, I couldn't get such good writers to work with me. That was really smart. And a guy like Capra didn't have the confidence to do that. Hawks didn't need the ego boost of his name on the script. Capra, after a while, the good writers wouldn't work with Capra because he kept demanding credit, Yeah. But Hawks always was one of those guys who developed the stories. That's one reason there's a stylistic and thematic consistency to his work as well. Not every director did, though. Like William Wellman directed 7 films in 1933, and they, he didn't have time to develop the scripts. He would just shoot them. And John Ford, in parts of his career, he joked about they'd throw the script on the porch Monday morning and he'd go in and shoot it. And but later in his career, if he cared about a film, he would develop it with the writer in detail. Some films more than others, but it's a complicated process. You have to get into the documents and find out how these people work. But anyway, but we're getting off Mank. Are we going to have some questions from the?
Well, if anybody has any questions, now is a good time. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the Upton Sinclair, which is sort of like the last third of the movie, and that whole scene about, the sort of fake news element, which I think is sort of brings him to his moment of conscience, which sets up the scene in the in the party where he does the Don Quixote story, which I just love. To me, the staging of both the costume party and the Don Quixote thing, and the staging of the of the big scene before that with the results of the election are both incredibly, wonderful, joyous things to watch. I mean, there are things where you just like viscerally enjoy the moment of the setting and how and the mise en scène of what's going on. And but do any of you want to talk about like Upton Sinclair and like that moment politically?
There's a good book by Greg Mitchell, which they rip off. And, I mean, another complaint I have about Mank is that they don't give credit to Greg Mitchell or Richard Merriman, who wrote the biography of Mank, that they liberally steal from, or to Mankiewicz himself should get a writing acknowledgement, because most of the good lines are his. But the Sinclair story, I actually, when I first saw Mank, I thought, I really enjoyed this part of the film, because that's a fascinating story of Hollywood and politics. But I felt that David Fincher was retreating anxiously into his subplot, is the way I put it, because it's not really. I mean, okay, you could say this is what kind of made Mankiewicz feel guilty about his
Right.
role. If you take the film at face value, it's not true, but that he encouraged Thalberg, who Wells said was the greatest villain in the history of Hollywood, by the way. He encouraged Thalberg to do this terrible thing against Sinclair. And then he felt guilty, and then he had this conflicted view. First, I mean, okay, if that's kind of what the film is about, which is sort of interesting. And I think that, the Hearst Mankiewicz conflict, I mean, is really an interesting theme that was brought up pretty well. It could have been better. And the whole thing with Davies, which is fictionalized, is very interesting and well acted and everything. They didn't really have to trample on history as much as they did, but to blame that whole Sinclair thing on Herman is kind of awful, really, when you think about it, because he had nothing to do with it. I checked, as far as I could tell, there's no evidence in Mitchell's book or Merriman's book that Herman was involved. Herman's politics, too, were all over the map. I mean, he was anti-Hitler. He wrote an anti-Hitler script that nobody would film, but he was an isolationist. He didn't want to go to war, and he made anti-Semitic remarks, and he alienated a lot of people in Hollywood. And the film doesn't show you that stuff, because that would complicate the picture. I think it's more interesting. I see Bart has a good point that we as film critics have a tendency to rewrite the film the way we'd like to see it. I guess because I'm spent my life studying Orson Welles. If I had done Mank, it would have been different, but that's not our job. I'm trying to look at it as what it is. I always try to do that. Like when I was reviewing, I'd look at a film, what is it trying to do and how well does it do it? But if it has some gross historical error or something, then I call it out.
So, Tom, I'm really curious, since you're teaching now, what are your students talking about when they've watched this? I assume somebody was, well, nobody's hanging out in your office anymore. But what are your students saying? And Joseph, you're also teaching. How are they talking about this film? And
film?
do they have the same affection for Kane that we did as a generation, when we were going to school?
That's a good question. I teach Hitchcock every 3 years. And so every time I teach it, I'm 3 years further away from his death in 1980 and from the films which really peaked much, much earlier. And I mention that because, as things recede further and further back. And what's interesting is that the kids still know who Hitchcock is, and they still know what Citizen Kane is, but the relationship with it is very different. The way Hitchcock works in the culture, the way a film like Citizen Kane works in the culture is very different. I'd say, the hardcore film kids at UT, which has got a very good film program, they're serious students of film and the film, and they're filmmakers, and I teach, courses in criticism, and history, but most of the kids are there to do production, and they, the serious kids, this film is on their radar. It's not a must see. So I mentioned that I was doing this gig, and very few of my kids in the Hitchcock class have seen Mank yet. It's not a priority for a college kid. And we're in this remarkable period with streaming, where the whole process of, and this of course is a Netflix film, but the whole process of making and watching and consuming and and distributing films is in the midst of a profound transformation. And add to that the fact that 2019, right before the COVID pandemic hit, you have this situation with Disney getting 30+% of the market share on 9 releases in 2019, 33% market share. This is the year that they launch Disney Plus. This is the year they buy 20th Century Fox. So we're something, and every one of those 9 films was either a Marvel film, a Pixar film, a Lucas film, or one of these quote unquote live action remakes of one of their classic animated films. So we are in a real, and that's what people are consuming these days, whether we like it or not. So we're in a pretty weird place, and I think students, that's where their heads are, whether we like it or not, and we may not, but that's the reality of it. And I've had to explain to people, Mank, what the hell's that?
Yeah. Sounds like a horror film. Like, I want to say it's great to see people like you guys who are all film buffs. It's a dying breed, unfortunately. I find at our school, San Francisco State, 90% of the students come in wanting to be directors, which is kind of pathetic because there are very few jobs for directors.
Yes, you can't make a living doing that.
That's considered the glamour job, but and some of them, as they go along, they realize, oh, there are other things. You could be a cinematographer, production designer, editor, and those jobs are more steady. But there's a lack of interest in classic films. Bogdanovich says you shouldn't say old movies because we don't say old symphonies or old novels or whatever, old paintings. Mm-hmm. But there's a lack of interest in the past. I just saw a Q&A Errol Morris did the other day on a film called Coup 53 that Walter Murch, an Iranian filmmaker, did. It's a terrific film about the 1953 coup in which the UK and the US overthrew the government of Iran. And they were saying, nobody remembers this coup. And Errol said, nobody remembers anything in our country anymore. Nobody knows. You can assume that nobody knows anything about the past. And they don't teach history much in schools. It's a rare student. Like I teach civil rights movement to some extent in my film class. I try to sneak in history into all of my classes because they desperately need some knowledge, but very few students know anything about the civil rights movement, maybe one kid, and that's shocking. And I've tried to find out why that was. And it turned out California a few years ago stopped teaching the civil rights movement in high schools. I mean, that's just appalling. And it stemmed from the tax revolt of the 70s where they started dumbing down education, and they don't get civics. That's why so many people don't understand how our government functions, and they don't care, because we had civics when we were kids. I'm sure you did. We have 3 branches of government. Most people don't even know that. And so Citizen Kane, they might know what that is, but a lot of students say, I don't like to watch old movies or black and white movies or blah 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 blah. And one student said that in a production class. I said, why do you want to be in the film business if you don't want to watch black and white movies? At least half of the movies ever made were in black and white. She didn't have a good answer, She should go into, I told her to become a dentist or something,
So indeed, it's hard to make a living as a filmmaker, as a film director, but it's even crazier to try to think you can get a living as a film critic.
Yeah.
So Tom, as somebody who is teaching people film studies and film criticism, what do they think of a future about film criticism? Because one of my pet peeves is like Dallas Morning News, major paper in Dallas, has no film critic. Wow. Like their film criticism is at this really sorry state. And look, we've been talking about the auteur theory for almost an hour. So there's still some interest in film criticism and film theory. What is the current state, and is there any hope for any revival of serious thinking about film and serious writing about film? Tom,
I think my sense is that we're film's an art form, and it's a form of cultural expression, and people at some level understand that movies are meaningful, and that good movies are meaningful in complicated ways, and that some movies are better than other movies. But I think back to a couple of comments, something Joe was just saying, and you were implying this too, Bart, that, there's a lot more pressure these years on, giving kids marketable skills and more practical information. And I think that's even true in criticism, history and theory classes. And there's been a pretty significant shift, and I've been part of it, in the field toward what people are calling industry studies or media industry studies or film industry studies. Just how does the industry work? How do we account for the making of movies and et cetera, et cetera? How and why do they get made, and what kind of impact do they have? And, I argue with kids all the time about, I'm not a big fan of comic book superhero movies, but how do we make sense of these things, of a phenomenon like this, which is pretty amazing, and in some ways, from my perspective, a tad frightening but fascinating. And can you afford to go into a business, whether you want to make movies or write about them? Can you go into a business and not have a fundamental understanding of how the industry works, of how to account for films that are successful, and have some sense of again of how they're created and how they're received, how they're processed by the society at large. So whether or not, without question, I mean, a real paradox right now is that more stuff is being produced, more quote unquote content is being produced now than ever. We're in the neighborhood of 400 scripted series on television. There's a lot of work there, and kids, I think, are disabused pretty quickly in film school, quote unquote, of this notion that they're going to be the next, whatever. I mean, that they're going to be a director, and I think the quicker they realize all of the stuff that goes on in the creation of films, I think the more they realize what the opportunities are. So these are interesting times. I think it's tougher than ever to make a living in commercial cinema and feature filmmaking. But I think there are more opportunities now than there ever have been because of new technology.
I think, just one thing I'll say, I'm teaching this John Ford class in about half an hour. We only have 11 students, but I'm grateful for those 11. But a few years ago, we'd have 30 or 40 or 50 or 60, and it's shrunk every year, and there's less and less interest. They really are not terribly interested. It's a rare student who loves films the way we did in the 60s, when we were all passionate about them and watched them all the time. And it's hard to get a job as a film teacher, but they're putting pressure on us at the university not to teach those kind of courses anymore because they don't draw enough people, and they want to have popular generic classes like comedy or horror films or whatever, which do attract people. But the idea of studying an artist's work like Wells or Ford or Hitchcock is kind of old-fashioned. But the last thing I'll say, William Goldman, the screenwriter, famously said, "Nobody knows anything about films." He put that in all caps. That was years ago, and even before COVID, the whole world was up in the air in terms of the future of filmmaking and distribution, exhibition. There were a lot of ifs, and people couldn't predict the future. And now it's completely chaotic. When will theaters return, et cetera? And it's affecting students. But one of the ironies is you can see older movies more easily now with streaming and DVDs if you care about them. Back when I was a kid, I had to take a Greyhound bus to Chicago to see Chimes of Midnight, because I thought I'd never see it again. But now you can buy the Blu-ray, but not
remember when Sarris's book came out, and remember how great it was that with every director you had a filmography.
We'd underline the films we saw, but I'd have to, I would go to Kenosha, Wisconsin, because they were showing a film on TV at 2 a.m, and I'd rent a hotel room so I could see the Bells of St. Mary's or something on TV.
I mean, there was, before the internet, the Sarris book was the book that let you know what the films you needed to see were. I mean, which is one of the reasons I'm making a film about Andrew Sarris.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because he was a wonderful writer and wonderful guy. But did I see any hands pointing up? People who have questions? Anybody? I'd love to hear. Yeah, Gordon.
Hey, kind of a comment, and I did like the movie Mank. I've learned a lot here listening to you guys with your knowledge on it. And I did, though, because I'm a stickler for accuracy, there's one scene I want to give them a big ticket from the anachronism police about. And that's where all the writers are, I hope I'm remembering this correctly. The year is 1930s, one of the flashbacks. And they're in the writer's room at Paramount. And the writers are all like bemoaning the lack of sophistication. And they start ranking on Universal for making Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Wolfman.
Yeah,
1930. None of those have been made yet.
Well, they even get the date of FDR's bank holiday wrong. I mean, come on, that's one of the. I mean, I lost track. I couldn't even catalog all the factual errors.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just a big part of American history. Get that right, you know. But there are a lot of little things that are just goofy in the film like that. And all those writers in the room, they just wanted to get all these famous names. They had a guy who's supposed to be Joseph von Sternberg who didn't look or act like him at all.
And the Selznick number was
Selznick guy.
Jim.
The funeral of Thalberg was pretty well done. But you know, it's kind of a potpourri. I mean, the recreation of the old Hollywood is charming in some ways, you know, with matte paintings or CGI, et cetera, you know.
Well, I think first of all, I only like to keep people for an hour. We've gone over that already, but I think if people who are just looking at things through Netflix watch this and then go back and watch Citizen Kane, who maybe have never watched Citizen Kane the first time, and then maybe go and see other Orson Welles films, and then get interested in these things, even if some of these things are historically inaccurate, it definitely evokes a time, a place, a kind of movie, and there's enough to get you thinking that I think there's a real service, and it's a really great thing. And
just the idea that somebody wrote a movie. I mean, Ben Mankiewicz, I want to say, he's unfortunate because he's Herman's grandson and he's lying all the time at TCM. He's always saying, my grandfather wrote Citizen Kane, and they buy the Pauline Kael myth. But it's just good to make a movie about a screenwriter. It's no surprise that this movie, first of all, gets Golden Globe nominations because it's an inside Hollywood movie. They like those kind of things. But to the average moviegoer, I don't think they care about, you know, a writer in old Hollywood. But you know, I'm glad Herman Mankiewicz gets some attention, and Gary Oldman did a good job portraying him. You know,
and I'm glad that Netflix spent the money to make this, because this was not an inexpensive.
Yes.
They did The Other Side of the Wind. They finished the Wells film.
Right.
We spent 48 years trying to get that film finished, and Netflix coughed up $7 million, and they were totally supportive. And the film came out. You can watch that film and see me as a 23-year-old kid.
And the documentary about them.
Yeah, there are two documentaries. They're hiding one. They don't want you to see the one about the post-production. It's really hard to find on there, but there's another good one about the making of the film. But yeah, Netflix deserves undying gratitude, and they've been funding a lot of other good films. The Five Bloods, the Spike Lee film, that's their film, for example.
And the international co-productions. It's unbelievable what they're.
Yeah, so they're you know, I'm a big fan of Netflix, but you know, their quality control department fell down with Mank.
And they're working with France to restore Abel Gangster's Napoleon too.
Yeah,
really?
That's something, a new restoration of Napoleon.
Oh my God. It's one of my dreams is to do a live screening of Napoleon with a real orchestra.
I saw that in Oakland, California, where Kevin Brownlow came, and the wonderful composer from England who did a lot of scores. I'm blanking on his name, but
I saw it in
Carl Davis conducted the orchestras on a huge
I had several friends who went to that. They just talk about it all the time.
That was exciting.
New York at the Radio City Music Hall.
Hey Bart, when things open up here, I've got the Region 2 Blu-ray of Napoleon. You can come over and see what the Carl Davis score.
Oh, do you really? Yeah. Is that I thought it was hard to find, but is it out of?
Well, it's region B, actually, I guess. Yeah.
Well, you can buy a region-free player now. I just bought a Blu-ray player. Yeah.
Jim has many things that nobody else can find.
Oh, good. We got some real film buffs here, but do we have time for a couple more questions before we have to depart? Or
does anybody have a?
Well, I just wanted to say the thing when I watched Mank, one of the reasons that I didn't take it so seriously as this is exactly what's going on is it's kind of like a movie version of Forrest Gump, because it's like, you know, he's there for everything from Louis B. Mayer beating up John Gilbert to, you know, everything you ever read is said in like a 20-minute period of time there, you know.
That's
So,
fun. It's
yeah.
fun to see that. And I mean, he actually was around most of that stuff, you know. Yeah.
I do have a question.
Okay.
Yeah, I see Christy.
Last question, Christy.
Okay, we've talked a lot about Herman Mankiewicz tonight. Does anyone have anything to say about Joe?
Well, it doesn't show him very much. He's a fascinating guy too. There's a very good book on him called People Will Talk, which is kind of like a interview / biography of him. He was a celebrated wit, and he was more conservative than Herman. He was a Republican, conservative guy. I'm kind of a moderate Republican who stood up against blacklisting, and then he caved in. Herman was more liberal, although he took some bizarre positions, as I mentioned. You know, he was an American firster, and et cetera, et cetera. They were complicated guys, but both great creators, you know. And there's a biography, Sidney Ladenson Stern did a biography, I think it's called The Brothers Mankiewicz. It's pretty good, that just came out. I'd recommend that. Yes. She does a pretty good job with Kane. She's scrupulous, you know, on that. But I would recommend Robert Carriage's piece, if you could find that on your databases, Critical Inquiry. Also, there's a book Carringer did on the making of Kane that writes about the script, you know, and that's really the authority.
Joe was a guy that was much more comfortable in the studio system than his brother. I mean, this is a guy who was a production executive and a multi-hyphenate producer and a director and a writer, and had a long and successful career. So he was and I do think you get that feel from that character. I mean, he was a different.
Well, yes, I'm working on a biography of Thelma Ritter, and he.
Oh my God, one of my favorite actresses. I'm so thrilled. I adore Thelma Ritter. She's, oh God, thank you. Thank you for doing that. I just saw The Model and The Marriage Broker again. Isn't that a great movie?
I love that. And Cukor directed that, and she at first had a little trouble getting used to him, but once she did, she loved him.
Well, it's such a, to me, I think that's the only movie, correct me if I'm wrong, in which Thelma Ritter plays the central character, even though she's not top billed.
The Mating Season.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
The Mating Season, yes. Gene Tierney and John Lund and Miriam Hopkins.
Wow. But Thelma Ritter is the main character. Okay. Thelma Ritter is one of those great actresses who's never bad. You know, I had a list in a book I did of actors who were never bad.
Yes, Charlie Brackett wrote that script for her.
Right, and Walter Reich, Billy Wilder writers. I'm doing a book on Billy Wilder now, and yeah, that was wonderful. I had all these great character actors. I just found out George Cukor discovered Nancy Culp, another one of my favorite actresses, and put her in that film. It's her film debut, and she was a wonderful actress.
Yes, and Denny Miller, who was on Wagon Train.
Oh, Denny Miller, she was in his film Sylvia Scarlett. I love George Cukor. He was a consummate Hollywood studio director. Our Writers Guild, I was there the night we gave George Cukor an award. This is the only time this ever happened. The Writers Guild gave him an award for being good to writers and respecting writers and not trampling on writers. Can you imagine? We gave a director an award, and it was so wonderful because he didn't write his own scripts. He didn't claim he did, but he would, if he was on the set and he needed a line, he'd call Garson Kanin and Ruth Gordon in their home in Connecticut, and everything would stop until they give him a line. They'd say, we'll call you back in half an hour, you know? And that's the kind of guy we like, you know?
And he would always walk around with pages of the script when he was on set.
Did he? Yeah, he was religious about the script. He worshiped writers. And to me, that's, I mean, I say in my piece on Mank that it shouldn't be a zero-sum game credit. That there's plenty of credit to go around. Credit the director, credit the writer, credit the cinematographer, Greg Toland on Kane. You know, all these people did wonderful work on that film, and to disparage any of them at the expense of another is just not nice. You know?
Disparaging any of the other people, it's about this character, you know. I don't see it as either or. But anyway, thank you both. This has been an incredible evening.
Thank you all. Thank you, Bart.
And
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you.
Thank you.
Joseph,
All you were a great audience. Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Thomas.
Great.
and
Good to see all of you.
Tom, it's wonderful to see you again. And by the way, Tom hired me to teach at UT for a little
Oh,
bit.
yeah.
And that was it was a really wonderful moment in my life where I got to be down there and hang out there. It was a big deal.
Well, it's a
Great.
thrill for me to be with Tom, whose work I've long admired, and to see Bart and to know he's doing his film on Saracen. Thank you, Raquel, for setting this up too. But thanks to all of you for having us. I mean, nobody disagreement is good. I always tell my students that you don't have to always agree.
Oh,
with,
absolutely.
what the heck,
Thanks
Indeed.
for asking us, Bart. I really enjoyed it.
And
Yeah.
Tom, at some point when I can travel again, I'd like to come down and interview you for the Saris project. I think you might
That'd be
have
great.
to
That'd be
say.
fun, boy. That was a big deal. I mean, Joe and I have been around long enough to, when the shit hit the fan back there in the late 60s. Those were the days. Those were incredible. That whole Sarah Scale thing and everything that was in the air back then.
So
Yeah.
Tom, do you have your copy of the book? I'm looking for somebody who's like made notes on their copy.
I've got it right over in this shelf here. I can
Yeah,
pull it
so
out.
do I. So do I. Held together by a rubber band, you know?
Yeah, and the covers are gone, but you write down. It was.
Right. Because
You underline all the films you've seen, and you keep saying, "I got to see this obscure film,"
Well, guys, I hope this is not the last time I see you, both of you. I hope that we can do some things together in the future. This has been just enormously wonderful for me.
Well, onward and upward up there in the Dallas area, pal. You did a great job up there. Keep it up.
Thank you, Bart.
Thank you, Bart.